Start the recording now. So I want to welcome everyone. I am Carol Wilmot with Resource Materials and Technology Center for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. And I'm joined today by Candace McIntyre from Duval County Public Schools. She'll be presenting on strategies to expose students who are deaf and hard of hearing to the general education curriculum. I want to make one exciting announcement before we get started, that this is our TA Live for the school year, but after break we will be back, and we've listened to some of your feedback regarding the days and times for the TA Live. So next year, starting in August, we will have a new day and time, which will be Wednesdays at 2 p.m. Eastern. So mark your calendars now for our next TA Live on Wednesday, August the 14th, 2019 at 2 p.m. Eastern. So now back to our regularly scheduled TA Live. You should know a bit about the Zoom environment before we begin. Today's webinar is being closed captioned, and I have dropped a link, and I'll drop it again in a minute if need be, on how you can adjust the settings for the captions so you can make them bigger or smaller and change the colors. So, but you have to do that from your computer. If you don't see them at all right now, go ahead and click that CC closed caption button on the bottom of your screen. So thank you, Sheila Barkley, for providing captions today from ACS. We want to make sure everyone can contribute to the conversation. So even though your microphone is muted, we want to hear your questions, comments, and thoughts and interact with others in this room. If you don't see the chat panel, click the chat panel button in the Zoom menu, and you can select specific attendees to chat with during the webinar or with the whole group. Above that field, where you enter the text, you'll see a blue drop-down menu. You should be able to select everyone if you want to communicate with everyone. I will be monitoring the chat with Sherry Conrad from RMTC, and we'll be dropping links and answering your questions throughout this webinar for Candace. As we mentioned in our email notifications, this webinar is being recorded, and it will be archived on the RMTC-DHH TA Live webpage. As a reminder, we do request that you take the post survey for TA Live at the end of this session. We thank you in advance for contributing to our continued self-assessment of our work. So with all that business done, I'd like to welcome Candace McIntyre one more time, and thank you for being here today. And I'm going to turn this presentation over to you now.
Perfect. All right, thanks. Hey everybody, how's everyone doing? I hope we're all doing well. I know it's the end of the year, so I appreciate you all being here. I know it's such a busy time. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that you all can see my PowerPoint presentation. So give me a second and I will bring that up. And here we go. So, like I said, hi, thank you all for joining us today to discuss how we can expose our students who are deaf, hard of hearing to the general education curriculum. So the painting that you actually see in this slide is from Nancy Roark, who is a deaf artist herself, and this painting represents the deaf mind. And to quote from her website, actually, is about how a deaf person thinks, perceives, visualizes, sees, understands with the deaf mind, perhaps in a complex way. The signs represent understand, mind, penetrate, visual, and the person in the painting is in deep thinking. So I love this painting because it shows how the deaf mind thinks differently than the hearing mind, and therefore we must teach our deaf students to think differently, right? Or teach our deaf students differently, I should say. Okay. I was just checking the chat. I saw some different chat things there, making sure that everyone was good. Okay, so moving on. A little bit of background about me. I attended the University of North Florida, where I received my bachelor's in special education with concentration in deaf studies. And then I received my master's from Gallaudet University in deaf education, ESL English Bilingual Early Childhood Education. I have taught both in the auditory-oral and total communication settings. And I also have experience in teaching students from pre-K through post-grad and teaching itinerant students as well. I'm currently the deaf hard of hearing program specialist for Duval County and have been in this position for 3 years. I'm also the current president of the Florida Educators of Students Who Are Deaf, Hard of Hearing, or FEDHH, FEDA is how we say it for short. And just a little shout out for FEDA, save that date for the conference, for the FEDA 2019 conference. It's in November 15th and 16th of 2019. And because I will brag on him any chance I get, I'm the proud new mommy of a new baby boy who's now 5 months old. I can't believe it's already been so quick. So now, seeing all your comments saying, "Aw, cute, thanks." I know, I kind of like them. I'll keep them around for a little while. All right. So moving on, the intended audience for this presentation is teachers of the deaf of students who use ASL, general education students, and inclusion or self-contained teachers of the deaf. Now, some of these strategies can also be used for kiddos who use listening and spoken language, but there are some specific strategies that are intended for students who use ASL. So, all right, our objectives are to describe the term accessible, to explain the link between language and literacy and making the curriculum accessible, and to explain the why of making the curriculum accessible to deaf students. Okay? So, I'm just gonna wait for a second for the captionist. Okay, so what's all this hype about accessibility, right? We hear this term accessibility all the time. So according to the 2014 Title II ADA policy, anyone with a disability should be given an equal opportunity to attain the same result, to gain the same benefit, or to teach the same, or to reach the same level of achievement as those without disabilities. And the public school system is required to apply both ADA and IDEA to meeting the communication needs of students who are DHH. So equal access is key, right? There's a difference. That's why I love this picture. There's a difference between equality and equity. Excuse me. Okay. Now, Luckner et al. Claimed that without well-developed literacy skills, students cannot participate fully in classroom learning, right? So it's often said that students who are deaf or hard of hearing, or DHH, are significantly outperformed by their hearing peers in the area of literacy. Additionally, it's also said that students with severe to profound hearing loss score significantly lower on reading assessments than those with mild to moderate hearing loss. Right? I'm sure you all experience this. So we all know the 5 building blocks of literacy, right? We know about phonemic awareness, the ability to hear, identify, and manipulate the individual sounds or phonemes and spoken words. Phonics, the understanding that there is a predictable relationship between phonemes and graphemes. And graphemes are the letters and spellings that represent those sounds in written language, okay? Fluency, the word for being able to read quickly, right, and accurately. Vocabulary, and comprehension. Now we're going to dive deeper into how we can use these 5 building blocks with students who are deaf, hard of hearing, and use ASL. Okay. Firstly, as stated before, well-developed literacy skills provide students opportunity for classroom learning. But strong language skills are essential for well-developed literacy skills. right? You can't have literacy without language. So, what's the difference between learning language and practicing language? There is a difference. So here a child is born, right? And is exposed to language from birth. In fact, actually, hearing children are exposed to language while in the womb. Okay. And by the time a hearing child enters into kindergarten, he or she has been exposed to language for approximately 2,000 days and is already practicing what they know. Okay. A child who's born deaf, on the other hand, may begin school with little to no language. Why? There can be many factors for that. Many parents may not understand deafness and lack the skills needed to expose their child to spoken or sign language at an early age. And then, 2,000 days later, the students who are deaf, hard of hearing are expected to master the same curriculum and standards as students who are born with exposure to the language. Too often, at the start of kindergarten, a deaf student is not practicing language, but is learning language for the first time. We see this all the time. Language acquisition delays can significantly impact a student's ability to comprehend concepts that might appear to be simple to hearing individuals. For example, you don't typically need to teach a hearing student who their brother or sister it might be, right? They're able to acquire that concept through incidental learning. Statements such as, "We need to pick your brother up from practice," are enough to allow them to make the connection that this child who lives with them and is picked up from practice is in fact their brother. If a child is deaf or hard of hearing, they may not acquire knowledge through incidental learning and will need to be explicitly taught who their brother or sister is. Students who are deaf, hard of hearing require supports to help them acquire the language skills that hearing students are exposed to at an early age. And many of you know this and see this. Okay. Anybody like SpongeBob? Such a fun show, right? Anyway, remember the episode where SpongeBob has to use his brain office to remember things about fine dining? Well, think of this link between language and literacy as students missing some office workers, right? There's no background knowledge for them to access in their metacognition, and therefore they fall behind by not knowing key vocabulary words during a lesson. Okay. I've seen this picture used in many educational presentations, and I thought it would be appropriate. This is how most of us feel when it comes to teaching our DHH students the general education standards, right? We feel that it's not fair to them. So we have to bridge the gap. How do we do that? Let's talk about the R word. No one likes to hear it. It often will get many eye rolls when mentioned in a faculty meeting, right? I'm talking about rigor. I often hated hearing this word because I would always think, my kids don't need more rigorous material. The regular curriculum is difficult enough for them. That is, until I realized that rigor and difficulty are not synonymous. So I love this chart to break down the differences, and I'll pause for a moment to let you read it. Hits home, right? Okay. So too often I see accommodations and modifications being mixed up. I was guilty of this while in the classroom. My first year of teaching, I thought, surely my students can't accomplish this. So I gave them material that was more on their level, quote unquote. I essentially robbed them of showing me if they were capable of learning the material. Rather than trying to find the accommodations for them, I modified the content. And I was given a wake-up call when our county was required to use the same curriculum at every school, the general education curriculum. And I remember looking at one of the lessons that I was required to teach my second graders on the Emancipation Proclamation. Yes, you read those captions correctly. The Emancipation Proclamation to my second graders. I learned about this in middle and high school. I thought there was no way they were going to understand anything that I was supposed to teach them. But to my amazement, they understood way more than I thought they were capable. Now, they weren't making A's and B's by any means, but using the appropriate accommodations, which I'll discuss in a bit, they were able to recall facts that from the lesson that I didn't think they were able to do. It was a humbling experience to see that I was the one limiting them. Another point I want to mention is when using modifications instead of accommodations, you are not getting a true representation of the student's ability. A student may have an A in the class, but that may not be an appropriate grade if the material taught was not the regular standards. Remember, accommodations level the playing field, while modifications change the playing field, change the field you're playing on altogether. So, how can we provide appropriate accommodations? Many of you have probably heard about UDL, or Universal Design for Learning, when it comes to the classroom. It has become the latest initiative in general education with a push for inclusion. But why not use it as teachers of the deaf? There are essentially three principles for UDL: providing multiple means for engagement, for example, utilizing smart boards, visuals, tactile learning options, etc. Secondly, providing multiple means of representation, showing the information in different ways with visuals, activating background knowledge, supporting vocabulary, etc. And then thirdly, providing multiple means for expression, demonstrating what they know in different ways. So using ASL video to present instead of having to present orally, writing a paper instead of presenting through speaking. So we're going to dive into some UDL opportunities for teaching our students. Excuse me. So the Colorado Department of Education has a great breakdown for types of services for students who are deaf, hard of hearing. Each level of support has specific examples of services, and to quote my friend Sherry Conrad, it is so relevant to UDL for kids who are DHH, which is true. It can provide great ideas to general education teachers and teachers of the deaf alike in providing UDL for all students. So I want to give you a second to look over that. Okay. So let's talk about some strategies for making the general education curriculum accessible. Every single time I would start my reading lesson, I would do a preview of the lesson, okay? I created a smartboard presentation or a PowerPoint and included key vocabulary words from the story for the students to preview. This was providing multiple means of representation. I would find pictures that correlated with the words, and then I would cover those pictures up so that the students only saw the word first. I would ask them what the word was, and if they didn't know, they had to fingerspell it, and then I would uncover the picture and provide them the sign. I would have them then fingerspell it, sign it, and then fingerspell it again, and then point to the word on the board. This is called chaining. It's an ESL English Bilingual Strategy. Now, I know what you're thinking. I don't have time to do this before every lesson. There's so much to do. And I hear you. I hear you. But I found that by doing this first, it saved me time in the long run. Remember back to our SpongeBob analogy, many of these kiddos do not have the background knowledge to know a lot of these key vocabulary words. So we teach that to them first. We save time by trying to explain it to them later during the read aloud or during an English lesson or a history lesson, or pick whatever kind of lesson that is language rich. I would typically have a unit that I would follow for many of my reading lessons, right? For example, we did a whole unit on Greek mythology. So for each read aloud story, I would add on key vocabulary. By the end of the week, I would have one of the students be the facilitator themselves. So on my presentation, it had different slides with key vocabulary words for each of the lessons. And it was the student's job then at the end of the week to be the teacher, quote unquote, and to review the key vocabulary that we learned throughout the week. And I had all the pictures covered back up again, and they loved playing the teacher. And not to mention, one, it allowed them to show me what they knew by a different means of expression other than taking a test, which I did give them a test later because we had to show, their knowledge through the curriculum, because that's how we have to do it. But it gave me that different means of expression. And then two, it also empowered them in their own learning, because they had to be the teacher. They had to answer questions. If the other students didn't know the words, they had to remember and they had to help them. And it was just fun to see them all collaborating and learning together while I just kind of stood back and watched them do it. And it was great.
Sorry to interrupt, Candace. Can you explain the chaining strategy more?
Sure thing.
And if the link that was just dropped, research brief on importance of fingerspelling for reading, it explains the chaining and the sandwiching of fingerspelling. But go ahead, Candace.
Yes. The chaining and sandwiching are very similar. Chaining just happens to have where it's actually written somewhere where the student can actually see it on the board or on a piece of paper or whatever. So you have the word written on the board, okay? You fingerspell it, you sign the word, you fingerspell it again, and then you point to the word. So say I have the word, I think in the research brief, the word is tornado. So you look at the word tornado, you fingerspell it, T-O-R-A-N-D-O. I think that's how you spell tornado, yes. And then you sign it, tornado, right? And then you fingerspell it again, tornado. And then you point to the word, okay? That's chaining. Sandwiching is where there's nothing written on the board. You're just doing it from visual only. So just fingerspell, sign, fingerspell. That's sandwiching. Or it could be the opposite. It could be sign, tornado, fingerspell, T-O-R-A-N-D-O, and then sign again, tornado. Okay. Those are both really good strategies to use. Another thing I did want to mention, and I'll get into it with fingerspelling later, is something that I use too whenever I'm fingerspelling is breaking down by syllables. So tor, nay, do. It helped them stick it in their brain a little bit better, rather than just T-O-R-A-N-D-O. We broke it up into syllables, tor, nay, do, and it helped them get that a little bit better, which is another great strategy. Does that answer the question?
Yes, and then we had one more extension. Do you define the word to?
Oh, absolutely. If they don't know, I always ask them, do you know, what does that mean? What does that mean? And if they didn't know, then I would go into it and define it. Absolutely. But that's why there was always a picture to help them. So if they didn't know the word, I would uncover that picture and they would see the picture and they would be like, oh, I got it. I understand. I know what that word. And I would tell them, well, what does that mean? What does this picture mean? What does that mean? And if they could tell me, great. If they couldn't, then I would explain it. Yes. Yes, Kara, thank you. Chunking. That's what I meant by that. T-O-R, nay, do. It's called chunking. I couldn't remember the strategy. Thank you. Okay. I hope that answers y'all's question. We're good to move on.
Yes. Sorry.
Okay. Taking that as yes. Okay. Okay. So how do we expose the students to phonics and phonemic awareness skills and the building blocks for literacy? Well, as we mentioned, finger spelling, right? Something that my teachers are probably tired of hearing me say is, I wish I had finger spelled more when I was in the classroom. And it's true, I wish I did. And I'm sure they're sick and tired of hearing me say that. And did you know, so in this research brief that Sherry put in there, I got all this from that research brief, that native ASL signers use fingerspelling for 10 to 15% of their assigned discourse, depending on the topic. Native ASL signers. Deaf teachers use over 50% more fingerspelled words than hearing teachers during classroom instruction. 50%. Hearing L2 or language 2 learners of ASL, including classroom teachers, tended to use neutral fingerspelling. And neutral fingerspelling is the use of fingerspelling for proper nouns or English words that do not have a sign. So hearing teachers tended to use neutral fingerspelling almost exclusively. As a result, children in these settings often miss the advantages of more advanced forms of fingerspelling. So essentially, hearing teachers of the deaf are only fingerspelling when there isn't a sign for an English word. Also, fingerspelling provides a linguistic link to English vocabulary and syntax. Language and literacy. Deaf students who are strong readers are better at recognizing fingerspelled words. This shouldn't be shocking. Now, with most of the teachers of the deaf being hearing, which is a whole nother issue altogether, we've got to do better. While we're on the subject, it is a big pet peeve of mine to see hearing teachers of the deaf verbally communicating with another hearing person in the room, right? Just because the person you are talking to is hearing doesn't mean you should stop signing. Remember, hearing kids get lots of incidental learning by having language all around them. So if we're denying that access to our kids, then we're denying them the opportunity for incidental learning. Now, if you have something private to say to somebody, sure, but set off to the side. It shouldn't be something that you should just drop your hands and start talking while these deaf kids are around you and have no idea what you're saying. That's not fair. Okay. Now, Y'all, we're in a technological age, so let's use it to our advantage to promote UDL. Anyone ever given the excuse of, I wasn't sure what to do, for a student who didn't do their homework? Well, if you provide the directions via ASL in an online notebook, then they can't use that excuse. So in Duval, we use Office 365, so we have access to OneNote where this can be used, but you can also use Google Classroom or even Google Drive to do this. And I know Katie Owen, who's with us actually today from Fiddler Springs, has used this Google Classroom as UDL for her students before, which is great. And I think she's going to share with us at the end of this presentation how she uses it, which is awesome. Now, did you know research has shown that reading aloud to children has a profound impact on their language skills? Yes. So the general education curriculum has standards based on read aloud stories. A great example of multiple means of representation is pre-recording these stories in ASL. Excuse me. So I used to either record myself or would use an interpreter and record them interpreting the story. And then I would then either post it on YouTube or just plug in my iPad into the projector, and we would watch the story as our read aloud. This helped the story, the read aloud story, be more smooth rather than being choppy, where I was looking down, reading a section, interpreting it in my head, signing it, looking down, reading a section, interpreting it in my head, signing it. It got choppy. So I wanted it to be more smooth and then to see a better language model than me doing that. So, and because it was on YouTube and or on my iPad, the students were able to go back and rewatch the story on their own when having to answer comprehension questions in like a different center where they could do it independently. Another really great example of this is using HP Reveal. It's an app that you can use, and you can do this with whole stories, with a whole book even. So you can, the student will put their phone or put your phone or parent's phone or whoever over the book, and then it'll have the story signed. And this can be a great listening center for them. So some means of, or some examples of means of expression are, for example, for a written essay would be allow the student to record themselves signing it, and then you can go back, they can go back and look at it to write it down later, because they do have to practice their writing skills. But they can record themselves first, record themselves signing their story or their, you know, essay, whatever it is. And another example is allowing the students to show what they know, that they know this a story by recalling it via ASL. So I used a rubric from Reading A to Z for retelling that allowed me to score the retell via ASL. So a lot of times I've seen in the general education setting, because I was an inclusion teacher, I saw the general education teacher sitting with a hearing student, and they would have to retell the story verbally, right? And then they would score it on a rubric. Well, I thought, well, we need to do that with these kids who are using sign language. And I had a rubric that I used from Reading A to Z. You can also allow the use of graphic organizers or pictures in a retell, depending on the level of the student. Reading A to Z has a rubric for completing graphic organizers that you can use to grade. I didn't share it because there's copyright things, so I couldn't share it with you all. But Reading A to Z has lots of really good resources. So those are some different ideas for using technology as universal design for learning. Okay. Speaking of technology, I cannot tell you how many times I'll see the teacher of the deaf not using the FM system for their students, especially if those kiddos are using sign language. So whether this be the students who are in the general education setting or self-contained setting, I see this happening all the time. They think that because they pull the students in a small group that the FM is not needed. Not true. If we're going to insist that these students take their amplification seriously in the classroom and in the real world, then we need to be examples for them in all environments. The goal and expectation should be for these students to be proficient in both ASL and English, right? That should be the expectation. Whether that be written and or spoken English, but they should be proficient in both. So if they use an FM in class, then they need to use it across all settings. That was just my little blurb I wanted to put out there. So we must embed literacy language opportunities throughout the entire day, okay? I would incorporate fingerspelling into everything. When we were sitting waiting for the bus, I would do an activity where I would fingerspell a word and see which student could provide me the sign the fastest. And then whoever did, whichever student did, had to fingerspell a different word, they had to do it. And we all took turns. That was just while we were waiting for the bus. Another example is my teacher aide, who was deaf herself, would sometimes greet the students in the morning by fingerspelling. How are you? Right? Instead of signing the words, she fingerspelled them to see how good their reception was. And this helped them with their fluency. Using rhythm and rhyming to make activities fun is also another way to embed literacy learning opportunity throughout the day. Yes, even with deaf students. So check out the FSDB Pineapple PD video on this, and the Handsland is actually on Amazon Prime right now. I do think you have to pay for it, but it's really great about rhythm and rhyming, and it's all in ASL. It's great. And I just wanted to share one of the most profound things ever told to me was, well, why don't you do why do the deaf kids not have an ASL language arts class? I was speaking with a principal at a public school that had a deaf program, trying to explain to her why a 5th grade student was on a kindergarten reading level due to all the factors of language deprivation that had happened. I told her that many of our students are coming to us having to learn ASL and English for the first time. To which she replied, well, why aren't we giving these kids an ASL language arts class like we give English language arts or ELA to hearing kids? And I thought to myself, well, for goodness sakes, why aren't we? So at that site school, they are having an ASL language arts block embedded into their ELA time. So they use the ASL standards, Fairview, and fingerspelling our way to reading. They use all those curriculums during that time. I would also suggest that you check out the ASL Curriculum Instruction and Assessment, ASL-CIA website. Their website is full of really great resources and even lessons that pertain to the ASL standards if you're incorporating this kind of ASL language arts into their ELA time. We got to bridge that gap, guys. And without getting that language that they need, they're not going to learn the English if they don't have a strong foundational language first.
Candace, I'm going to interrupt. We had another question. Can you give more examples of advanced fingerspelling versus just when there is an English word?
Advanced, say that one more time. Could you say that one more time?
Hey, Candace, this is Sherry. I think Kara is experiencing technical difficulties.
No problem.
We had a parking lot question. Can you give more examples of advanced fingerspelling versus just when there is not an English word for that, for the word that they're spelling?
Yeah, sure. I mean, just fingerspelling throughout the day, just like what I talked about with chaining and sandwiching. Even if there isn't a word for another, like I said, with my deaf para, she would fingerspell how are you. That's more advanced. Instead of signing how are you, she would fingerspell it, and then she would make the kids fingerspell back I'm good or I'm happy. So those are definitely more advanced. So where the research was talking about how hearing teachers of the deaf only use neutral signing, meaning if there was even like in a story where there's names, so like Pete and Paul, a lot of times they'll only fingerspell Pete and Paul, and a lot of times you'll even hear see hearing teachers of the deaf give them sign names, right? Pete will be up here, Paul will be down here, but deaf teachers rarely do that. A lot of times I see them doing just fingerspelling it the whole time, Pete, Paul, throughout the whole story. And then some more advanced, I mean, even for high school kiddos, whenever you have like vocabulary that has a sign to it, because we have different ESL dictionaries that have science and math words now, which is great. But so they have a lot of those signs actually attached to those words, but we need to give them those fingerspelling to make them be more proficient in fluency. So I don't know if you need more examples than that, but I really like the chaining and the sandwiching ideas of giving them that fluency for them. Does that answer that question?
I think so. We haven't had any follow-ups from it, so I think that was a pretty good explanation.
All right. Okay. Oh, thank you. I see that you put the ASL STEM dictionary in there. Perfect. Through DefTech. Okay, speaking of DefTech, DefTech is the Technology Education Center for deaf and hard of hearing students. And they have a wonderful, really wonderful handout for the top 10 things DHH students would like teachers to know. So with that being said, these are really great to share with general education teachers. Things like, don't use words like this and that as reference in the class or lab, right? Say, go put the pencil on the desk. Don't say, go put this on that. Have the PowerPoint and lecture notes available for the students before class, right? There's such a thing as hearing fatigue and eye fatigue from watching an interpreter all day, or for those kids who aren't using sign and are just using amplification, you know, they get hearing fatigue for having to strain to hear and listen to everything that's being said. So providing those lecture notes beforehand is really helpful. They also want you to know, treat all students equally. They're all the same. Just because they can't hear, that's the only thing they can do everything else, right? Have a positive and flexible attitude. This is what students want you to know. Also, interpreters are not always an accurate reflection of students when voicing for them. So this is something important to tell general education teachers, that if maybe they don't understand what the student said through the interpreter, rather than getting frustrated with a student, maybe think that, well, maybe the interpreter didn't sign it or didn't voice it correctly. So just ask for repetition, ask for clarification. Also be aware of process time. So it's said that to provide 3 seconds of processing time for after asking a question for a student to answer. And this is in regards to general education students. So understand that there's a processing time of about 5 to 10 seconds between what you say and then when the interpreter signs it to the students. So there needs to be even more processing time for kiddos who are deaf, hard of hearing who use interpreters. Also, when presenting visual material, so for example, showing a PowerPoint, using a dot cam, give students time to read before moving on. Allow deaf students to have access to the first few rows in class and on the first day. This is something that teachers of the deaf should be helping the students with too, part of their self-advocacy and the expanded core curriculum. Don't force groups of deaf, hard of hearing students to work together, right? I see this often. Before you establish groups, ask students privately for their preferences and group assignments. Sometimes they want to work together, and that's great, but just because they have a hearing loss doesn't mean that we need to stick them all together. Sometimes they have friends that are not deaf or hard of hearing. And lastly, if you're using a laser pointer, allow the pointer to remain on the object for an extended period of time. This allows the students to watch the interpreter with what you're saying and then look at where you're pointing. Okay. So these are different strategies that the students actually want you to know for making the general education curriculum accessible to them. And I think they posted this. There's the actual handout for the top 10 things that deaf students want you to know that is in the chat box. So hopefully most of you have seen the Optimizing Outcomes for Students Who are Deaf, Hard of Hearing Educational Service Guidelines by the National Association of State Directors of Special Education, Incorporated. Ooh, it's a word. Or NASDE is what they call it, NASDSE for short. So to tie everything back together, NASDE mentions that through the Every Student Succeeds Act, or the ESSA, states must ensure that assessments comply with the ESSA standards, including the requirement that the assessments are valid and reliable for the population, and states also must ensure that appropriate accommodations are available in compliance with IDEA, Section 504, the ADA, or other law. So in other words, we have to provide equal opportunities for success for our students. Also be sure to check out the RMTC draft calendar for more professional development opportunities to help with these types of strategies put into practice, like the visual learning for literacy book study, the finger spelling our way to reading training, and the visual phonics training, and more. So check out that next year's calendar. There's lots of really good trainings that will help link all this back together too. Thank you all so much for spending your time with me. I hope that you were able to get good information out of the presentation. Thank you so much to RMTC for putting on this professional development for teachers of the deaf every single month. We're so truly blessed to have you all in the state of Florida. And if you have any further questions, feel free to contact me. There's my contact information right there. I think we might have some time for questions, and then go ahead.
Yes, we do have time for questions. We'll keep answering those. Candace is going to stick around, but we are going to have a special additional presentation from Katie from Fiddler Spring, who taught a middle school classroom, and she's going to show us that Google Classroom real quick. So if you'll stop sharing your screen, Candace, then Katie can take over and start sharing her screen, and she's going to show us how she used Google Classroom, and she recorded different videos to be able to share. And I do have from Judith White from one of our B's specialist. So thanks for this session. Candace, you did a great job explaining these basics. However, I'm confused about the title. We certainly want to do more than expose students who are deaf, hard of hearing to the general education curriculum. We want them to master it. Could you elaborate on that?
You're absolutely right, Judith. Yes, we want them to master it. And that's the whole point of this presentation, is that I think the point of this presentation was that a lot of teachers struggle with the gap between language and literacy. And so they struggle with even teaching the general education standards in general. So giving them different strategies to help teach that, to help expose them so that they can master it, if that makes sense.
Thank you, she says, yes. Yes, and it's a hard job trying to make that those accessible materials, because, you know, this is 3% of the population of students, and a lot of publishers don't want to put the time and the effort and the money into making the materials accessible for students who are deaf and hard of hearing and sign language. So it's quite a struggle that we have, as teachers of the deaf, have to do a lot of the creating of that. We will continue to answer questions in the chat and whatnot, but I did want to give Katie a chance, because I just thought it was phenomenal when I saw this resource, and it was very similar to what Candace was doing in Duval, except for this was at a middle school level and using the Google Classroom. So Katie, if you'd like to share, that'd be great. And I'm gonna.
Okay, hey again. So I'm going to preface this by saying I never used to think or consider myself a techie person at all. So this was really all, I felt like my middle school kids, I was basically like a support facilitator, inclusion teacher, everybody, they all have different names in the districts. But this was a brand new position. I didn't know what it was going to look like. We had 7 students, so they were between the ages of 6th and 8th grade. So I realized very quickly I could not be in all of these classes. I was not the interpreter. I was a push-in support. And basically what I realized was my job was about how to make the curriculum materials accessible to them. So let me share my screen.
Can you move your microphone a little closer to your mouth? Are you able to do that?
Sure, is that a little bit better?
Shannon, is that good, or?
Can you hear me?
Okay, she'll watch the captions. Okay.
Okay. So, can you guys see my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, perfect. Basically, what I did was for each of my students, whichever classes they were in, again, this was, well, at the time, 6th and 7th graders. I had 6th and 7th graders. But we wanted something that would be lasting. We didn't want to just reinvent the wheel every year. So we created a classroom for each of the kids. So you can see there's a 7th grade math class, 7th grade language arts, all the different sciences, plus a couple other ones. So I Am Deaf was just a place where they could go to locate some resources. We had resources for parents, because we encouraged the kids to share out with their parents. We contacted the parents to let them know ahead of time that we were going to be doing this. So we were trying to get them on board. And then also in this district, there was no professional development really for our interpreters. They're all contracted. So that was kind of a point of contention, and I wanted something so that my interpreters could continue to develop and have a place where they could like collaborate. So a collaborative space for them. So this was everything that all of the classrooms that we did. And then specifically language arts, 7th grade language arts was very, very challenging. At the very beginning of the year, the class read the Red Kayak. And we just didn't have enough time in the beginning of the year. There wasn't the amount of communication with the gen ed teacher that we needed. And so, you know, straight out of the gate, she had her class reading this book. She was reading aloud to the class, but it just, like, the kids were really struggling with it, because she would do some of it in class and then she would have them read at home. But our kids just couldn't handle reading at that level independently. So they missed out. The teacher tried to find something that they could read, she brought in a couple like first grade novels, and I said, we have to figure something out, but ultimately they missed out on that class reading, being exposed to that novel and the themes in it and all of that. So this is kind of where the whole idea came from. So what I love is that I started the year at the middle school and I transitioned over to Fiddlers in January. And I'm the creator of all of the classrooms, so I get all of the postings when the interpreters post new videos. This 7th grade language arts class is doing another novel, and it's called Freak the Mighty. And I get postings almost every day to let me know that the lead interpreter that's in that classroom, she's a nationally certified interpreter, is posting videos. So she's listening to the audio, and you can see when I clicked on here, these are all of her postings, and she's doing it for every chapter of the book. She's doing it ahead of time, and I was looking, and I'm sorry, there's student names here, but I love this one because she does a couple-minute video to explain the word cripple. She ties in a personal reference with her dad, all to develop a schema for them. So they have exposure to the content, like Candace said, previewing those words and those terms so that when they go into the class and start interacting and engaging with the material, with the teacher leading, that they already have some background knowledge. So this is how we were able to do it. I had a Surface Pro that I was able to get from my ESE department, and of course Google Classroom, but there's I used an app called, actually it's a Chrome extension, called Screencastify, and I found that that was the easiest thing to do because when we created the videos, they could be downloaded directly into my Google Drive, so it just made everything a little bit easier. So that's what we did with Google Classroom. That's about what we could come up with. I would love if anyone could share more ideas about how we could improve on it, or if there's other apps or things like that. I would love that because the interpreters are hungry for this, and now my high school group of interpreters, they want to start doing it next year to support their kids.
Thank you so much for sharing this. I think it's phenomenal. When I saw it, I was so thoroughly impressed, and I was been thinking about how to bring this in and share this with others. So I thought it fit perfectly with today's webinar. And I just shared the link for the Screencastify. I've seen some a little bit modified, but I like where they use the Seesaw app. But I think the Google Classroom or the One Notebook with Microsoft Office is a little more permanent. And then Candace shared the ASL CIA, which is being developed with a variety of schools for the deaf, where they're grouping together all the different ASL resources by category. And it's a $20 a year membership to go there. And they have all sorts of topics in ELA, math, science, social studies. But yeah, it's kind of our job to figure out how to curate it as teachers of the deaf for our students at their appropriate levels. So that is one option, is that ASL CIA, where they've gone through like YouTube and all the different forms of media and trying to bring them together. But with all our students reading different books, you know, it's hard to keep all these together, and with our students keeping on moving up. But if anybody would like to share in the chat any resources they have, that would be great. So we are coming near the end here. It is almost 2 o'clock. So I want to tell Candace, thank you so much for presenting today. We really appreciate it. And Katie for jumping in and presenting a little bit here at the end with your information. This was all some wonderful information. And we would also like to take this time to thank our CART provider, Sheila Barkley from Alternative Communication Services, for providing the captions today. This is the last TA Live for the school year, but we will be back again next year, and we hope you will have a restful and enjoyable summer break. Stay tuned. As you know, we've posted our draft calendar, so we've got to finalize those dates and get our TA Live topics. We have some ideas. We're just trying to confirm who's presenting when. We also want to thank you so much for being a part of our day. You're the reason that we have these jobs and are able to keep doing this research and providing this information to you. The recording will be posted on the RMTC-DHH website. We love hearing from you, and we are happy to help in any way we can. You can connect with us through social media like Facebook, Twitter, and Pinterest. You can also sign up for our newsletter, and we'd love to hear your comments on social media and about what you've learned with hashtag RMTC-DHH. If you will just put TA Live or other, we'll work on getting the survey, the title for today's presentation. As you may know, we are a Florida Department of Education, Bureau of Exceptional Education and Student Services discretionary project, and all the services we provide are provided to you at no cost. To continue our work, we must collect our survey data to justify why our services are needed. If each of you could please complete the survey right now, we'd greatly appreciate it, and we'll work on getting that title in there. For now, you can just put other. And if you had a colleague who missed today's broadcast or would just like to rewatch this, you can head on over to rmtc-dhh.org, TA Live. And thank you again from all of us here at the RMTC-DHH staff. We hope you have a phenomenal summer, and we look forward to seeing you next year, remember, on Wednesdays at 2 p.m. Eastern for our new date and time.